afternoon, everybody. Sorry we were starting a few minutes late. I appreciate everyone who is here today. Kind of to give you a background as to what led to kind of this presentation. As you have all seen within the last year, our culture is kind of changing, and maybe what was not a big deal 10 years ago is a big deal now, as far as references or how people interpret information that's presented to them. And we actually will cover a few cases that were from the 80s or that are older, but as you've seen in the news, just cultural as a whole is paying more attention to or making it more important interactions with individuals. So one of the things that I had talked to the TLC about was, as faculty, what are some things that could happen or said or demonstrated in a classroom that could potentially get us into a little hot water. And there are many topics that are covered in our criminal justice, sociology classes, etc., that are very sensitive in nature. And so what can we do as a faculty to make sure we are fully protected from situations where we are presenting information or we say something that could offend a student or cross that line? The TLC, this is co-presented by the Provost Office and the TLC, and Heather is going to kind of go over some cases that have ended up in court, and then we'll call the panel up, and they'll kind of give you their area of expertise from a Title IX or academic freedom perspective, and then they may provide some information, and then that'll be the time to kind of have a dialogue with the panel. So, and feel free to have a dialogue at any point through this process. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming. Era's making me use the microphone. All right, so as Evan has said, that the TLC was asked to provide some background information that will help frame a context for this conversation. And so, and again, after I'm done with that, that will be when you can have the opportunity to ask questions. I probably really can't answer your questions because I'm just providing the background information for you at this point. So we'll convene the panel eventually, and they will share with you their expertise, and we can open up for conversation at that point. So these are just some of the objectives that when we were working with Evan, that we were putting this forum together to try to accomplish. And again, one of the most important things about this is to have that dialogue with one another. All right, so as I was trying to think about this ahead of time, I had a conversation with one of my colleagues, and I told them the topic, and they said, well, I'm a little confused by the topic. How does Title IX fit in with academic freedom? And they said, my understanding of Title IX is that it's about gender equality, it's about gender discrimination, and it's about gender or sexual harassment. So they said, I don't really get how this fits into that. So I'm going to kind of leave that for now as your understanding of Title IX until we convene our panel. I think that's a pretty good starting point. I'm going to move to something that I think faculty are a little bit more comfortable with, which is the concept of academic freedom. So I want you in your own mind to think about what is your perception of academic freedom? When you hear this term, what shapes your thoughts? What do you think that means? How do you practice it? So kind of think about that. And while you're thinking about that, also think about, does that word freedom mean you can do anything? Or does it have some restrictions in place that we maybe need to think about a little bit? So are there limits to what we can and can't do? So the American Association of University Professors has some information on their website that helps frame this a little bit. So they have some information about the First Amendment and academic freedom. So we'll look at what they have here. So on the First Amendment, they say that it protects expression on all sorts of topics and in all sorts of settings from regulation by public institutions, including public colleges and universities. So clearly we're not at a public institution. So it might leave you wondering, where does that leave us? Well, that's where academic freedom steps in, right? So academic freedom, as the AUP tells us, addresses the rights within teaching, learning, and research, both in and outside of the classroom, for individuals at both private and public institutions. Right? So this is more relevant perhaps to us at this institution. And they also tell us that, thankfully, in the academic community, higher education has recognized academic freedom both in the practices that it puts forward and in the policies that are written for faculty. So I posed to you that question about what does academic freedom mean and what might there be some restrictions. So here's some ways to think about this. And I think one of the things that, to me, when I think about academic freedom, it's what makes being a faculty member so great, all right? So you have these abilities to kind of have those intellectual conversations, to engage in debate with students, with colleagues, to have that mental meeting of the minds, and to converse about topics that are in your field, outside of your field, and that makes it engaging. And in turn, we can bring that into the classroom with us, and we can carry on those conversations with our students in the classroom. So we have the right to go into our classroom and decide that I want my students to get this content knowledge in this way. So I'm teaching in this field. Here's what I think needs to happen from this particular course perspective. Here's the topics I want to address. Here's how I want to do that. I want to have a dialogue in class with students. I want them to write essays. I want them to engage in group activities. I want them to read scholarly works. I want them to write essays. I want them to produce this product. Here's how I want them to interact with the material. And here's how I want to get them to show me that they've learned the material. So we also have the right to choose our assessment techniques. All right, so interacting with students, how we engage with the content with our students, these are all rights that we can bring into the classroom with us and choose the way we want to do that in the classroom. We also have the right, through academic freedom, to express views that we hold. We can do this through conversation. We can write about it, we can blog about it, we can email about it. So there's a variety of different ways that we can express those views. And on top of all of that, we have the right to say, I disagree, okay? I don't like what you're saying, or I don't agree with that philosophical view that you hold. And that's part of that intellectual exchange that we're allowed to have. So we do have a lot of rights. And I know some of you are probably looking at that next column, at that top bullet point, going, well, of course we can't do some of these things. That doesn't make sense. The problem is, and this is part of why we're here today, is that sometimes we do get into that gray area where we don't realize that perhaps something that we've chosen to do in our classes, maybe an activity, maybe a content, whatever it is, may be bordering into where the student feels as if they are being harassed. All it takes is one student to feel that they are being harassed for you to now have an issue that's starting to arise, okay? A complaint, and that's a starting step. Whether it's legitimate or not is another issue, but it is a starting point. So while we all probably do understand that it's not within our rights to harass, threaten, intimidate, ridicule, or even impose our views on our students, that is and can be a gray area if people don't stop to think about what they're doing and whether it might be perceived that way. So while I told you that it's okay for us to go in and do different pedagogical approaches to address our content, we do have to be careful that we're not starting to head into a legal boundary. Right? So we have to be mindful of these things and pay attention to what are we choosing to do, and are we heading in a direction that we really want to go. So the next question for you to think about is, have you ever thought about the legal ramifications of your classroom presentation? So whether that's in content, whether that's in the way that you're interacting, or the things that you're asking the students to say or do. Have you ever thought about that? And many of us haven't, but that's why we're here today, to start thinking about these things. I will tell you that there is a very common misconception, and this is held by many faculty, and that is that faculty have the unfettered right to speak or teach in any way that they want, as long as they focus on the subject of the class. Courts have not always said that this is okay. So courts have ruled that if you are violating any institutional prohibitions around discrimination or harassment, that these are things that those individuals in the class are protected from by the First Amendment or principles of academic freedom. Your words, the things you're doing, are therefore not protected. All right? So this area, this is why we're here, to think about how do we avoid getting into this place. So there are some court decisions. I'm going to do sort of a synopsis of some of these court decisions. These are all kind of old. They are actually from the 90s. And in many cases, legal scholars have since written about them and discussed where, if we were to look at this later on in time, would we have looked at this the same way, or what did this court do? And a lot of this is almost to me like you just toss things up in the air and where they land. That's how the court case went. Because if you hear some of these court cases, one sounds very similar to the next, yet who they found in favor of went differently. Okay? And on the previous slide, I made the point that institutional prohibitions on discrimination or harassment. So some of these legal cases, or at least one of these legal cases that we'll consider, the institution itself did not have a policy that was written, and that was kind of the loophole that was left. So in the end, the faculty member wasn't really having a decision made in their favor regarding academic freedom, but they were actually having the court say, your institution didn't have a very good policy written, and so we found a little loophole. Okay? Okay, so all of these cases are from the 90s, as I said, and some of them are found in favor of the faculty, and some were found against the faculty and in support of the administration. In every case, it became a court case because the faculty member was perceived to have done sexual harassment, had some either administration come in on it or students complain, and then the faculty didn't like the outcome from the college perspective, so they filed a lawsuit. All right, so it went to court. And in every instance, the reason that the faculty members cited for going to court was because they felt violated in terms of their academic freedom or their First Amendment rights. Okay? So I won't repeat that information throughout, just remember that for every instance that was the case. All right, so in Vega versus Miller, we'll start there. This is a case of a non-tenure track faculty member by the name of Edward Vega. And he was teaching a remedial English class where he did a word association exercise, which apparently is for the purpose of helping students to come up with other words when they're writing, so they're not continuously using the same words. And so this is a pedagogical thing that was sound in his field. And of course, he asked the students to pick what they were going to do this exercise with, and they chose the topic of sex. So the words that started to come out, you have a few of these in your handout. There are others that I've seen online that are even worse than what you see there, became quite graphic during the context of the class. So administrators found out about this, and they decided that his conduct would be considered sexual harassment, and they decided to not renew his contract. Remember, he was non-tenure track. So he sued, as I've said, and the federal appeals court sided with the administrators. What's interesting to me about this is that he was using what apparently is a pedagogically sound technique that might be used in writing classes. And the students actually chose the topic that they were discussing, but at no point did he stop the conversation, and that's where the court sort of ruled against him. They said, you had the opportunity to stop this. That didn't infringe on your academic freedom to stop this activity. All right, so Vega v. Miller was found against the faculty. Another instance, and this one is cited a lot in the readings that I looked at, Silva versus University of New Hampshire. In this case, several students came forward and accused a tenured faculty member who was a writing instructor, Donald Silva, of sexual harassment because of sexual analogies that he was using in class. The university reprimanded him for violating the sexual harassment policy, and they suspended him without pay. He then had a formal hearing, and they found that his comments contributed to a hostile academic environment. They put him on leave without pay for a year and told him he needed to go seek counseling before he could teach again. So of course he sued. And the federal district court sided with Silva. They said that the statements that were made were not definitively sexual, and that he was actually relaying coarse content through his analogies that he was using. And so what is worth considering here is that if you look at this case, and legal scholars have written about it and have said that if you were to take this into a non-academic environment where there's no academic freedom to discuss, these would have been likely a clear case of sexual harassment. Right? So again, this is this gray area of academic freedom that we're talking about here. The other interesting thing about that case is that the student descriptions of what happened in class and the faculty members' descriptions of what happened in class were very similar, but they were just a little bit different. And if you read it, you can see why what the students say happened would be concerning to them, and you can probably see why what the faculty said happened, he didn't think it was a big deal. And they're not that far apart. But the court chose to go with what the faculty members said had happened in class, and they dismissed what the students said had happened in class. And I do want to make sure that you guys understand, again, as I've said this already, these are older cases. A lot of things have happened in between, and I know when the panel convenes, they may hear something about how relevant some of these cases may be today. But again, context, trying to give you a context for what has happened in the past. All right, the next case, Cohen versus San Bernardino. This is the one where you see on both sides of the chart up there. So what that should tell you is that initially they were found against the faculty, and then the faculty member appealed when it went to court again. So we'll do the background here. Dean Cohen, one student filed a complaint against this English teacher who utilized what he called a confrontational teaching style designed to shock his students and make them think and write about confrontational subjects. And if this particular student said that the complaint was in response to very specific readings that were assigned and discussions around controversial topics, including those of a sexual nature. So the college again determined that he had violated the sexual harassment policy. This went to court where, well, the Board of Trustees first told him that he needed to attend a sexual harassment seminar and be aware of how his confrontational style teaching might impact his students. And they wanted him to warn the students ahead of time that this was the way his course was taught. So he sued, and of course, in this case, the first court, the federal court, found that the school, this is different than what other things have. They found that the school's policy on sexual harassment was constitutional. So they were looking at the policy itself on sexual harassment. When he appealed, the circuit court said that the policy was too vague. So he sort of got out of this, and this case sounds very similar to others that we've heard, because of the policy itself as written by the school was too vague for that second court. All right, in the last case, Rubin versus Eikenberry, this is another tenured faculty member, this time in education. So Louis Rubin was removed from the classroom and terminated after making numerous in-class remarks of a personal and sexual nature. And he argued that he was teaching modern values, morals, and social conditions, and that sexual topics would hold the interest of his students. So he sued after the college removed him, and the court rejected his arguments, saying that his in-class comments were exceedingly remote from the First Amendment's concern with protecting socially valuable expression. His comments do not appear connected to course content, which was supposed to teach elementary school social studies, okay? And the degree of departure from the expected course content to his comments appears extensive. So 4 cases, very, very similar, maybe a little different, and I'm sure our panel can talk about these more or other similar cases. I wanted to leave you with a few quotes that come from some legal scholars, and again, these are various times that these have been written. In this case, this person says, academic freedom is about education. When hostile behavior gets in the way of the educational process, academic freedom must give way to equal opportunity. Another legal scholar says, uncertainty over where the line should be drawn between an experimental or audacious pedagogical approach and sexually abusive speech continues to plague the courts. This is not written all that long ago, 2012. And finally, when professors create an abusive academic environment by implementing an unnecessary and unwanted element of sexuality into the classroom, Faculty speech evolves from constitutionally protected offensive speech into unprotected sexual harassment. So again, the purpose of coming here today is to have conversations and think about just how these issues play out in the classroom. How does Title IX affect what we can and should do in the classroom? And so at this point, I'd like to invite our panelists to come up, as I said before, introduce themselves, tell us why they were asked to join today. And if they have any commentary specific to what I've presented, that will be a great time, and then we can open up for conversation. So I hope we'll have a good conversation today. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm Lee Templeton. I'm an associate professor in English. I likely was asked to participate because I was the only member at AAUP that could be located. And I said yes, so I really have no employment myself.
Hi, I'm Ed Naylor. I'm here, I guess, because I'm the Title IX coordinator and I guess Vice President of Legal Affairs here, so this is kind of my bailiwick, and appreciate the opportunity. This is a difficult, complicated topic, and hopefully we can work through this and at least start some conversations that may go even deeper and help you guys be in a position where you're not worried about what you should or shouldn't do and can't do, and that's kind of why we're here today, is to help you guys start working through the framework of what should I do, what shouldn't I do, what can I do, what can't I do.
Hi everybody, I'm Jessie Langley. I'm the Associate Dean of Students for Campus Life, and I believe I was asked to be here just to share some student development perspective on student experiences that I may have come across and some scenarios that may come up. Do you guys want to comment on anything from the slides?
I don't have anything to comment on, specifically, no.
I have a couple comments I'd like to make. One thing about the lawsuits is you'll see, and that was a very good job, by the way, of summarizing those, and there are some of the similar cases out there. The real problem with those cases is that was before the Department of Education kind of turned everything on their ear in 2011 when they issued the Dear Colleague letters, and then everything that's happened since 2011 has basically left the state of the law prior to that time in a completely different situation. So I wish I could say, turn to page so-and-so, go to this website, do those things, and you'll be fine. Unfortunately, that's not at all what the state of the law is. Things are very complicated right now. They're very confusing. If you talk to different attorneys who specialize in this, you're likely to get different opinions on different things. So what I hope that we can walk away from today is some situations and some ability for you guys to start thinking through how to go about answering your questions. Some of you, this topic is probably of not much consequence. Some of you teach in areas that certainly these types of subjects come up. One thing I would like to point out about the cases that were talked about today are, if you look, all of those cases were situations where faculty members said or did something, administration took some type of action, a lawsuit resulted between faculty member and administration. I'm not really worried about those types of problems. The problems I'm more concerned about that we may see with the state of our students and how they react to things these days is students whose faculty member and institution, and we're in court trying to justify what's going on to keep us all on the right side of that. And the other thing to remember when you read lawsuits, to remember when the court said this, the court said that, the court took this approach, the court didn't take that approach. That's after the result of about a 5-year lawsuit. That's after a lot of angst on everybody's behalf, after a lot of money spent, after a lot of time spent. I practiced law for about 23 years. Most of that time I did litigation work. I've probably been involved in 1,000 civil lawsuits, and not once at the end of that lawsuit did I have a client say, man, I'm so glad we went through that. That was the most fun thing I've ever done. Every one of them, even the ones that had a great result, said, I wish I'd never met you. Because it's not fun, and nobody wants to be in that situation. So what I hope we can do is help you guys develop a toolbox of ways to avoid being in that situation.
sure any specific commentary aside from, I think we're all more aware of, and I think we're all very engaged in our students here at Wesleyan, from the faculty I know. So I think we do know our students bring a variety of backgrounds to Wesleyan. It's different than the experience I had as a college student and in my friend circles, the things I learned that our students have experienced and experienced in some cases while they're here. But the baggage that a lot of our students brings, I think, has been an interesting context to keep in mind as I consider their impressions, their perceptions of things, and reading through some of these things, it's just difficult to imagine knowing what some of our students have experienced and possibly sitting through. I know we do not have these examples in our classrooms, so. But I think we're on a campus that tries to understand our student experiences, and that's a good thing.
Mark, if you're gonna make. So again, not necessarily connected to any of the court cases, but I do think it's worth sort of being aware and careful not to confuse sexual harassment and hostile environment sexual harassment as defined in Title IX with offensive speech. We have legal protections against the former. We don't have legal protections against the latter. And so for students to claim they were offended by something is not necessarily a legal issue. We all get offended by things on a daily basis, and if we, took it to a legal sort of down a legal road every time that happened, it would be very tired of people. So, I think from the faculty perspective, material that may be challenging or may be viewed as offensive by some, when presented within the context of the curriculum and the subject matter, is not necessarily something that we need to be too worried about in terms of legal sort of ramifications. I think a lot of us would agree with the idea that education is supposed to be uncomfortable, and we are supposed to sort of challenge our students to, encounter and engage with ideas that they may be uncomfortable with. Now, that being said, we all certainly can exercise care and concern in sort of judging how best to present those types of that type of material or those types of content or discussions. So, as a faculty member, that's something that I think is important to sort of distinguish between, so that we aren't freaking out by saying, oh my God, this might be offensive, so I better really police myself. So yeah.
I think that's an excellent point, Lee, and I think that's well taken. We don't have a right, people don't have a right to not be offended. They have a right, according to the Department of Education, to not be harassed. There's a difference there. Part of the problem I see as I read through this is at some point the Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, kind of merges and blurs that line, and it becomes a situation where if a student claims they're offended, and the offense calls them things that may be sexual in nature, or comments that may be sexual in nature, OCR is starting to look at those differently than that. And I think the AAUP has an excellent document, you guys may want to see that, and it's called The History, Uses, and Abuses of Title IX. It's from the AAUP Bulletin in 2016. It's a great article, and it goes through a lot of what I think what Lee's talking about. So to start with, let me say this. This is a 2001 official guidance from the Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights. And it first kind of talked about making sexual harassment kind of more aware on college campuses. To begin with, the OCR and the Department of Education was very clear how this played into freedom of speech, and very clear how it played into academic freedom. And so I'll just read a sentence real quick to you. The 2001 sexual harassment guidance states, Title IX is intended to protect students from sexual discrimination, not to regulate the content of speech. OCR recognizes that the offensiveness of a particular expression, as perceived by some students, standing alone is not a legally sufficient basis to establish a sexually hostile environment under Title IX. In order to establish a violation of Title IX, the harassment must be sufficiently serious to deny or limit a student's ability to participate in or benefit from the educational program. Moreover, in regulating the conduct of his students and his faculty to prevent or redress discrimination prohibited by Title IX, in responding to harassment that is sufficiently serious as to create a hostile environment, a school must formulate, interpret, and apply the rules as to protect academic freedom and free speech rights. That was in the 2001 guidance. And if you can see, and I won't bore you with reading a bunch of stuff, but if you read the AAUP document I just referred to, you can see from where that was in 2001, they kind of, the next time, they don't really mention academic freedom as much, and they don't mention freedom of speech as much. And so we're left with a situation now where instead of an objective standard that they started with in 2001, the OCR now looks at situations from a subjective perspective of how a particular student took it, took something that you said. And so you may be in a classroom with 25 students, 24 may, no problem. 25, it may be a big problem. And as Jesse pointed out, it may be because they've been through some very traumatic experiences and they're not so much of a snowflake as they are someone that's damaged and had a lot of bad things happen to them. So I'm not criticizing the students so much as I am, and I'm not criticizing the Department of Education, but it's clear that they've walked back from their initial strong stance in favor of academic freedom and freedom of expression.
Yeah, I'm not sure how long Title IX is, but is there any chance you could just read us Title IX or read the part that's relevant to what we're talking about?
Well, Title IX is actually only about 3 sentences long. I don't really have that. The guidance that the OCR's issued kind of, if you read, and I wish I'd have thought to do this, if you read the actual Title IX, it's about this, just about 3 sentences. There are somewhere around 600 pages of official guidance telling us what those 3 sentences means, and so there's kind of, the guidance has eviscerated the actual text of it.
So the definition, the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights enforces, among other statutes, Title IX of the Education Amendments of '72. Title IX protects people from discrimination based on sex in education programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. Title IX states that no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance.
Thank you.
And so how we wound up with what we have now, from that, only a federal bureaucracy and a bunch of lawyers could come up with. But that's where we are, and that's the problem, is that it leaves faculty members who are trying to teach and do a good job. It kind of leaves you in a gray area where you're not really sure what to say or what not to say and how someone may be affected by something, and you're just kind of in that situation. I will read something to you, and this is again from the AAUP Bulletin from 2016, and it's kind of towards the end of their discussion on this topic, and again it's 10 pages to get here, but it says, instead, the OCR's approach to compliance has become increasingly punitive. So what happens is this: a complaint will be made against a university or a college, and the OCR will start investigating. As any government agency, the OCR can bury any college, even Harvard Law will scare people like that, because they just overwhelm you with work. They can kind of keep things tied up forever. And so what the institutions want is to be done with the OCR and to move on. So they enter into some type of consent agreement where no one really admits any wrongdoing, but the institution says, going forward, we'll do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And that then becomes official guidance for the next college or university to say, well, Harvard did this, Yale did this, Oregon said this, and so then people like me read these and say, well, if we do these things, we'll be okay. And so it keeps progressing, and it keeps creeping into, in this case, creeping into the area of academic freedom, that if you read, the case law, you wouldn't think that, but then once OCR says this is now official guidance, and all consent agreements are official guidance, it just keeps creeping, it keeps creeping. And so that's where we are now, is it's continued to creep. So I'll read this last sentence to you again from the AABC document. It says, the sharp increase in the number and scope of OCR investigations and in OCR findings that institutions have violated Title IX has brought great public attention to the OCR's heightened scrutiny, not only of sexual assault on campuses, but also of speech that includes sexual references of any kind. Now, the AAUP document is not in favor of the OCR approach. I agree with much of what they say, but that's where we are as guidance, and that's all we can do is go by what the OCR tells us. And so the bottom line is, anytime you venture into any discussion of a sexual nature in class in front of students, you just need to be careful and make sure it's really closely tied to what you're trying to teach. Now, obviously, if you're teaching a human sexuality class, that's completely different than teaching a introduction to mathematics class. I mean, obviously, some subjects are more down that line. An anatomy class, you're obviously going to talk about physical anatomy and things of that nature, so some of those things are going to happen. So, my advice is, if you want to make sure that you don't get a letter from OCR, you don't get a lawsuit from a student, or you don't have me calling you saying, I had a student come to me last week and they're really upset about this, and they talk to you about it, I would just stay away from those topics as best you can. I mean, if it's germane to what you're teaching, then you need to teach it. If it's not germane to what you're teaching, I would advise as your attorney to stay away from it and don't put yourself in that situation where you have to go there.
So can the panel speak to, there, as you stated, there are faculty who will be covering topics. CJ could be covering prostitution, human trafficking, and so what are some of the ways that those faculty can further protect themselves, either through their syllabi or disclaimers, and also how do you feel they can approach brand new students who don't know them, have not earned their trust yet? Can you speak to that?
I don't know if I can. Well, so I teach literature, and it may seem like that literature might not be one of the subjects in which these types of discussions would arise, but it is, and they do. And so, there are many pieces of literature that I teach that do sometimes deal graphically with sexual situations, for instance. And I'm not going to shy away from that. I think, and I certainly could do a better job of this, but I think, as I mentioned before, just sort of being a bit more aware that, our students, and I don't know, I would imagine maybe even probably 1 in 5 of our students have probably had some sort of trauma in their life, maybe involving sexual assault or, any number of things. And keeping that in mind, and therefore being a little bit more deliberate about how you present and frame that conversation. Maybe that is in the syllabus, a sentence that says, this material is graphic in nature, not to excuse them from reading it, but just to give them a bit of forewarning. And then before the conversation in class, maybe again reiterate that this is, even maybe the class before, say, next time we're going to be discussing this. If it is something that you feel, is going to be a problem for you, then come speak to me, is probably how I would handle it. And we would, work on a way that you met the course requirements, but that also, respected the concerns that the student might have. And so, I think that is one relatively easy way to sort of just make everybody a little bit more aware of it. Whether that is enough in terms of legal coverage, I don't know, but it certainly would be something that I think would be easy to do.
Well, as Ed was talking, that's what I was thinking of, what tangibly can you do in those situations, and that's similar to what you said there. I was thinking, as much as you're able to explain to students, I think sometimes students don't know what to make of content, and they may fill in the gaps. If it's not explained to them why certain things were used as examples or presented as content, they will fill in that gap to explain it for themselves. And to your point, Evan, if you're a newer student, you may not know that professor well enough to get it anywhere close to filling in that gap. So they may make misjudgments about your intentions, and I think if it's possible that you can explain some reasoning behind content chosen, if there's any chance it could be offensive, and provide information about resources, not just, we have Canvas counseling. A lot of students will shake their head and say, oh, yeah, but they really have no idea where the counselor is, how to make an appointment, but really being a great resource to give contact information, making sure students know how to use the resources, and trying to be an open door if they have questions about talking further about why certain content was used and rationalizing through that, because part of the developmental stage where the students are as well is trying to get through who they are as a person ultimately by the time they leave college, and some are further along than others with that, but figuring out for themselves how they feel about whether or not they've personally been one of those 1 in 5 or so, which I don't think is an unfair guesstimate, unfortunately. And I think the national statistic is 1 in 4, actually, that college women experience sexual assault at some point during their college experience. And I think that's from 2015. But even if you're not one of those students who's had that experience, you may be a student with a certain moral compass that may be offended that the topic even came up in principle. And so I think those students are still trying to decide for themselves somewhere between, they come in some with a very, it's black and white, it's right or wrong. And by the time they graduate, we're hoping that they're more towards a relativistic perspective of things in context, and things are not always one or the other. But it takes a lot of effort unpacking that with a student to understand why certain things are appropriate in one setting and not another. So we think a lot about that out from co-curricular things that we do too, about having to be extra careful about the example we set, and because students are learning from that, and they can some be very black and white. Oh, Jean Langley did it, it must be okay, when the context might have made it okay, but wouldn't in other situations. So just remembering that developmental roadmap from our students, in addition to possibly being offended personally, I think gives some good suggestions towards that as much as you can. And I know that might be a hard pill to swallow, that we don't have, why do I have to explain myself? Well, I think it's a matter of having to, and what's maybe more educational and beneficial for the student outside of the subject matter you're even teaching on, but in terms of their life education. The more you can spend time helping them understand your reasoning helps them learn and move forward and decide for themselves what's right and wrong and who they want to be.
I had a professor in law school that said over and over, so it's ingrained in my mind, a good lawyer will advise someone to wear a belt and suspenders. And so lawyers look at things a little bit differently than other people do. So I'm going to give you some practical things, Dr. Duff, and some of them may not be along the lines of what the UP would like from a academic freedom standpoint, but it would be from a practical perspective how you avoid dealing with these issues and how you avoid putting a student in a bad situation. One would be obviously put it in your syllabus. Absolutely put it in your syllabus. I also think you should warn students. I don't like trigger warnings in general, but I think you should give them a heads up, and I think you probably should think about not doing that. Hey, now we're getting ready to talk about something that some of you may not may find uncomfortable, so it may cause you some issues. At that point, no 18-year-old freshman is going to get up and walk out of the room, because that's not cool. So maybe you do that, and then the class now, next time we meet, we're going to be discussing some things some of you may find uncomfortable. Then you give them a warning they can not come, or they can come to you afterwards and say, after class, and say, I don't know that I want to be here for this, or I'm dealing with some issues, I probably don't want to do that, or is there an alternate assignment I can have? And then you should consider whether that alters the learning outcomes you're trying to engender. If it affects that, then that's obviously your right as a faculty member with your academic freedom to do that. But those are some practical things I think you could do to not put students in those positions, and therefore not put you and the college in the position where we're on the opposite, same side of the V of the lawsuit, which we don't want to happen. And so the other thing I would advise you, and again, it's just from a practical how to not get sued perspective, is I think if if you're teaching things that have graphic nature or sexual nature, to really think, do I have to do this? Can they learn the same thing from a different type of subject? Do I have to talk about something that's sexual in nature for them to learn how to critically evaluate and read through something? And again, that's your right, that's part of the academic freedom, but that's what we're talking about, is how the two mesh. And I would tell you, if I were faculty member, I would strongly analyze anything I teach in that area and think, can I do this a different way and have the same educational result for the student?
Okay, I'm gonna raise the uncomfortable topic. A couple of schools ago, I taught in a biology class, studio format. We had to sit in on, one of the other classes to see how it was done. And this woman who was an amazing biology professor would just say, things like, "We're gonna talk about sex. I love talking about sex." And I was thinking, whoa, man, if I said that as a guy, I would be, can you comment on the susceptibility of males compared to female? Have there been any lawsuits against female professors? What's the incidence of, males being more susceptible than females in terms of number of lawsuits filed?
I do not have any numbers for you, but I do have one of the current cases making its way through the court system is a female professor at LSU. Some of you may have heard about her. A longtime faculty member was fired by LSU for saying and doing some things that the college found inappropriate. Some of them in the classroom, some of them outside the classroom, and that is actually in the court system right now. I'll check and likely see if there's an update on that, but that's an example of a female student. I certainly think that the majority, this is just anecdotal, I don't have any evidence to support this, but I think this is probably true. The majority of our students who have suffered from sexual assault or sexual abuse or things that would have caused them to be particularly susceptible to some things are female. Certainly not all students, there are male students that I know of that have been through some terrible things as well, but I think that's probably the majority of what you would see. And most of the time, it's probably at the hands of a male perpetrator. And so I think if a male is saying or doing something to a female student, there's a greater likelihood that it's going to cause an issue than if a female faculty member says that same thing to a female student. That may not be the way it should be, but I think practically that's probably the way it is. So I think if I'm a male faculty member, I'm extra careful what I say around female students. And as a male staff member, I'm very particular and careful what I say around female students. I'm careful what I say around male students too, but even more so female students. I mean, I practice that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Doesn't it have to do a lot with how it's presented? If the male is standing there drooling, looking at the voluptuous woman sitting in the front of the class and says, "We're going to talk about sex," versus, "Hi, this afternoon we're talking about sex." End discussion. Too many people get hung up on, like you just talked about, male or female saying it. When I took undergrad sex education, the woman walked out like Miss Lilith. Her hair was pulled back all the way, she wore a short skirt, and there was no fooling around when she said it. The 300 students, 90% of them were male. So, presentation makes a great decisive factor on how it's presented to the class.
Well, I'll speak to that. I mean, especially in 2018, I don't think, whether it should or shouldn't, I don't think that presentation does play into it a lot. Does the presentation, as you described, could it make it worse? Yes.
Yes.
But does it play into the initial harassment or offense or the perception of the student? I don't know that it does. Again, you have to base it off what's happening in the legal system, and regardless of what any of us think in this room or what guidance AAUP provides for us, at any point, any situation, as we know, could become a legal situation. So why would you want to put yourself in a situation if you didn't have to? Now again, as Dean Naylor has said, as Dr. Templeton has said, we obviously want to present what we need to present to educate our students. And I don't think anyone is saying that we shouldn't. But I don't know that presentation in 2018 impacts it as much as it may have 20 years ago.
And this is not exactly tied to that, but I would say that as a faculty member, I think it is one of our jobs as faculty to help our students learn how to discuss difficult topics and how to have conversations about issues that make them uncomfortable or that maybe they do find offensive. It's part of the training in critical thinking. And so, I certainly would not want us to feel that we should, stay away from these types of topics. Because then it limits sort of what we attempt to do. And so, I think this is what causes some of the anxiety, is that this is a valuable skill that our students can learn, and done correctly and done well, it will be beneficial to the student. Finding that sort of correct way of doing it without, crossing a line, I guess, it is tricky, but it certainly doesn't mean that we should abandon all attempts to do so. I mean, that is one of the things that we need to help our students understand, is that they can have conversations about issues that are difficult or disturbing or offensive to them without it necessarily becoming a heated argument, or without it necessarily being viewed on their part as a acceptance of that particular belief or anything along those lines, I think.
I'd like to address your comment. I agree with you to some degree. You certainly can make it worse by the way in which you say it and the way in which you approach it. I went to East Carolina in the 80s, so, it was a different era.
Is this your professor?
It may have been, and it was a different era. Some of you went to college earlier than that, and it was a different era in the 60s and early 70s, but it's a different time and place today. Our students, you see the culture, you see how people react to things that my generation kind of just, some of it's good, a lot of that's great, that students are more reactive and are more on top of things, and things we didn't do well, they're doing a lot better. This is one area that students, I think, are less forgiving than they used to be. Some of it, they don't think they should be offended. Some of it, they're truly carrying a lot of things around with them, and things that you wouldn't think would bother a student will really affect them. I would just say this about this whole area of sexual harassment, and that's what we're talking about, is a student feeling like a faculty member saying something creates them to feel sexually harassed, is, I learned a lot in law school, and I learned to thicken my skin a lot, and faculty members would jump down your throat. It's almost, if you ever saw the TV series of the movie Paper Chase, it was like that. You'd stand up and you'd be berated, and you sit down in a little puddle of tears and feel sorry for yourself, and that's part of the process, was to get you to learn to deal with those things. I think that's a great thing to teach students to think, to teach them to deal with things that are difficult and to expand their horizons, expand the way they look at things. But don't take something because it's sexual and say, well, I'll make them uncomfortable and think about this, if you wouldn't take that same approach with something that would be equally as uncomfortable if it was dealing with gender identity or racial issues or things like that. If you wouldn't say something to offend a student in one area, question why you would do it in another area. Is there another topic you can use to create that? And that's just, again, something to think about from a perspective of how do we not get sued, which is my purpose of being here.
And aside from the getting sued, which is not my area, I'll try to work that through. The ethic of care in it, I would say that I can remember in the last month or two learning of a student, and she had chosen to leave campus for a few days because she was triggered by some content in a criminal justice class, I believe, that was of sexual nature. The student must have thought enough of the explanation given for why that was used, or the professor, him or herself, to understand it in context, because I don't think we've heard any concerns aside from her personal impact from, it brought some things to light for her that she'd experienced. And that's all it was. But I think that's a good example that's happened here recently on our campus that just helps us remember the ethic of care, because we could make a lot of students disappearing from class, and trust, we do know that plenty of times those are not for good, valid reasons, but on some occasions it may be. So if you see a student has gone missing from class, you might be able to step back and question whether any of the content or dealings in the class could have possibly been misunderstood or impactful, and just a warmth of reaching out. I know we have some very strict policies, and we need to on our syllabi, but that doesn't prevent us from being able to reach out and show some empathy and warmth to make sure there's not something more we can do to help a student find resources and things. Just like we don't want them to make assumptions about your intention with the content, as much as we can give benefit of doubt, even though plenty have given us examples not to, that there may be another explanation, and try to be there for them.
In the interest of keeping this to about an hour and in the interest of your time, we wanted to invite any final questions or any comments from the panel, if there are any out there.
Yeah, I just want to add, I guess, a different side to all this sexual harassment lawsuits. I don't know how much you guys know about the fitness world, but there are a lot of lawsuits in the fitness world. One of the things that I had to do in some of my classes, especially the classes that we are talking about measuring skin fold measurements and so forth and so on, I almost moved completely away from doing measurements on females, males measuring females, females measuring males. And unfortunately today, males will measure males and females will measure females. It's unfortunate because in the real world, that's not the situation. And I do emphasize to my students more than one time, if you're a male and you're going to measure a female, make sure there's a female fitness instructor with you in the room when you make that measurement, because of all the lawsuits. It's unfortunate, but this is the reality that we live in today.
All right, well, with that, I thank our panel and thank all of you for attending. And I'm sure they're happy to take